The Atheist Debates Patreon Project presents a debate review. Is Islam true? Two different debates. Hey everybody, I've done a number of different debates over the last couple of months, one of which I hadn't gotten around to doing a review on whether or not Islam is true, and I immediately did another one. I think my opponent for the second debate saw the first debate and then requested it, and it was like, let's do this and let's do it, in 2 weeks or whatever. And I said yes. And so rather than doing two different debate reviews, which really wouldn't be useful unless I was to go through and pick out specific things and quotes from them and piece it together, I thought I'd talk about this subject and both of the debates together to hopefully explain what I was thinking, what problems arose during the debate, and how you might address some of these claims about Islam. The first debate was done live in person at DebateCon 2 in the Dallas area against Kenny Bomer. And I thought, I didn't know Kenny, and I was interested in going up for this debate in particular because in-person debates are always preferable. Things tend to get usually slightly less heated than they do in an online forum. The second debate was online, and it was against Nadir Ahmed. The topic was exactly the same. Both of them said, I want to debate, is Islam true? I didn't suggest the topic. That's what they picked. And you would think with the same topic, the debates should be kind of similar. But I used different opening statements. Unlike some apologists, I tend to do something new for every debate. Some things get repeated. That's going to be evident. When we talk about truth and epistemology, how to demonstrate things, what is reasonable, there are going to be statements that I'm going to make hundreds, if not thousands of times over the years, but I like to come up with something a little bit different. In the first debate against Kenny, I talked about the basics of how to demonstrate whether or not something is true, and if what we're talking about is a doctrine that has a list of claims, what percentage of those claims need to be true for the doctrine to essentially be considered true, and what problems are there in determining, if only one thing is false, does that mean it's all false? If we were to debunk a single claim from this, does this mean the entirety of the religion is false? In the second debate, I talked about whether or not if something were reasonably true, then whatever God is behind it would have no reason to keep hiding. It's like playing hide and go seek with a child who goes around behind the rocking chair that has slats, and they grab a hold of the slats and they sit there with their eyes covered, and because they can't see you, they lack object permanence. They assume that you can't see them and they're hidden. This is sort of the nature of the God that many theists, not just Muslims, are often trying to get us to accept. They want to say, there's just so much evidence. There's so much evidence. It's so obvious. How are you so blinded? You must be intentionally being obtuse, or God's given you over to a reprobate mind because there's just so much evidence. It's impossible to not believe in God. And basically they're saying is, look, God's hiding right behind that rocking chair. I can see it. I can see his hands. I can't see his eyes because he's hiding his eyes, but I can see his hands. I can see his legs behind there. How can you not see this? If it were the case, and God was reasonably intelligent at all, that the evidence was just overwhelmingly obvious that God existed, then God would have no reason to hide. Whatever God is behind this should be able to just have conversations with people and present their case for things. And in the second debate, I also used a paraphrased version of a little script called Kissing Hank's Ass, which you can look up. I've talked about it before. The difference in the two openings really, really, really frustrated my second opponent. And I'm probably going to spend more time talking about Nadir than Kenny, but I'll talk a little bit about both of them. The things that frustrated him is, first of all, he seemed really upset. He was upset with Aaron. He also seemed to have prepared based on a small section of things that I used in my opening against Kenny, where essentially I rattled off a list of problems, potential problems in the Quran. And I was specifically pointing out that this is what a lot of people would say are problematic. where there are 7 earths, 7 heavens, geocentrism, was it all created in 6 days? The stars protect us from evil spirits, how the sky is a ceiling, humans are made from clay, sperm originates from the backbone or between the backbone and the ribs. And I was pointing out that these are general things, but what about more specific things where the Quran says everything's created in pairs, and we know that this isn't true. If all it took were to falsify one thing, we could falsify that, and we would be good. We'd be done. There's nothing else to worry about once we've shown that the one thing we picked out is false. Now we just throw it all out. He seemed to want me to present the same list, so much so that at one point during the debate, he was like, why don't you say any of the things that you said with Kinney? And I'm like, if there's something I've said that you'd like to bring up, it's up to you to bring it up. The notion that I'm not going to use the exact same statements in a second debate is just because I'm not freaking lazy, or I am lazy, but I'm not quite that lazy. He also didn't understand the analogy of kissing Hank's ass, and he really obsessed over the alcohol in moderation statement. And the thing is that the kissing Hank's ass, the list that I used is like, number 1 is kiss Hank's ass and it'll give you $1 million. Number 2 was use alcohol in moderation. You go through the rest of the list. Number 9 is don't use alcohol. Well, Nadir only heard, I guess, the first one of use alcohol in moderation and decided to focus on that, to say, no, any alcohol is bad. The benefits never, or the harm always outweigh the benefits. And the Quran is responsible for saving, millions of babies from fetal alcohol syndrome by telling people not to use alcohol. And he wanted to use a scientific study that said that even a single glass of alcohol could kill brain cells. But what he didn't do was demonstrate that killing brain cells is necessarily a harm, and a harm that outweighs the benefits. To just say that something is potentially harmful doesn't mean that it outweighs the benefits. And I would say that the jury is still out on whether or not the harm outweighs the benefits for a single glass or recreational use. And there are many medical organizations that have said, hey, having a glass of wine from time to time is actually good for the blood and keeping things flowing. Not here as a doctor, not here to recommend alcohol at all. The point, which he completely missed, is that there were a list of 10 things, and 2 of them were in contradiction, and all of them were supposed to be coming from a God. But not only was he upset that I didn't show up with the same list, and he was upset that I used this kissing Hank's ass thing, he also said that he didn't expect me to show up, and he dared me to post the debate on my own YouTube channel, even though we had an arrangement with the other one, which tells me that this is more about him seeking attention and that he is disconnected from reality. I had literally just done this debate 2 weeks before. He reached out to ask me to do this. I said yes immediately, or the organizer reached out to me and I said yes immediately. Whereas Kenny was a nice guy who simply misunderstood some things. He didn't have a great scientific understanding. And Kenny was incredibly impressed with the age of the claims. The number of times that Kenny said, oh, it's 1,400 years ago, 1,400 years ago. How could somebody have known this 1,400 years ago? Nadir believes that everything the Quran says about science is perfectly correct, and that this could only be true if Allah had revealed everything to Muhammad. In the 2 debates, there's going to be a difference in tone. Obviously, an in-person debate is going to be slightly different from an online debate. Both of them got heated. But, at the end of it, Kenny offered up a hug and seemed to get the fact that while we disagree about whether or not Islam is true, that doesn't mean that we hate each other. Nadir warned me before the debate. Like, we were sitting there talking before the debate started, and he was like, I hope you're ready. Okay. I mean, there was a lot of bravado and blush. I hope you're ready. I'm going to come at you like nobody else has come at you before. And have you studied up on the science? Because I'm going to be coming with lots of science. And I was like, I didn't have the heart to tell him that I hadn't really done any special prep for his thing. Because what he didn't grasp is that telling me all of the things that are correct in the Quran doesn't prove that Islam is true. And the subject of the debate is Islam true? If he had reached out to me and said, I want to debate you on whether or not the Quran gets some things right about science, I don't have any interest in debating that. I'd be very surprised if it didn't get some things right. Well, I'm going to say it gets absolutely everything right. Yeah, but then we're just going to get into interpretations where you're going to say, this is right if you interpret it this way, and this other thing isn't actually making a scientific statement, it's poetic, etc. In the first debate that I did with Kenny took time to point out that no one knows the correct interpretation but Allah. If that statement is true, then the debate is absolutely useless, because until Allah shows up to tell us what this means, everything else that we engage in, every bit of conversation we have about it, is a wasted time. If you're saying only Allah knows the correct interpretation, then what is the point of two people sitting down to actually debate any of this? That statement alone, which is the first, I think it's the first note that I took, it's one of the first things he said, should end all debate right there. Because Kenny's saying, I don't know what I'm talking about. Matt can't know it either, but let's have a debate about it. That's like a hallmark of absurdity. Kenny was also impressed with the spread of Islam, how rapidly it spread, which I pointed out, or should have, if I recall correctly. That only proves that people believed, which has no bearing on whether or not it's true. The notion that a religion spread and was shared is about us. It's about what people found convincing. And it is true for any number of religions. As a matter of fact, Christianity is incredibly fond, or Christian apologists are incredibly fond of pointing out how this tiny group of, disciples and apostles who were persecuted and, had governments against them and everything else, managed to really quickly spread this religion out to the world. And that must be proof that Jesus Christ is Lord. And the Muslims are doing the same thing. Kenny was basically saying, the spread of Islam, you can't explain that unless there's actually a God behind it. No, there's lots of ways to explain that, including if people are fighting wars and killing people and outlawing other competing religions. Kenny also said that Islam would eventually prevail over all other religions, which it clearly, obviously hasn't done yet. And so the time to bring it up isn't in the debate, but after it's happened. If in fact Islam does overtake all other religions, and it, as he was saying, Islam will enter every household before judgment, I don't know what that means. Does that mean that every household will be a Muslim household, that everyone will be a believer, or that everyone will have heard it, which is another Christian idea, which is, go ye therefore unto all the world, and none of this will come to pass until all have heard the Great Commission and all this. There are incredible similarities. And it's not surprising. They're both Abrahamic religions. They both Christianity and Islam originated from spin-offs from Judaism. And so the notion that some aspects of them are similar is not surprising. Nadir, instead of bringing up how rapidly it spread, wanted to focus on Islamic converts in prison, which is another thing that Christians are constantly doing. I remember Frank Turk was talking about his or someone else's prison ministry and how many people it reached and everything else. It's always seemed strange to me, one, to seek to convert folks who are going to spend life behind bars away from anybody else. I don't know why we would, not that I'm opposed to anybody, converting if it's actually real, but it's strange that these people who are a captive, literally captive audience, who have a vested interest in converting to some religion in order to demonstrate a significant change in their life to a parole board, are the people that we're so proud to have reached. If I'm in prison, the parole board needs to see something about my life, my character, my behavior has changed so that it seems that I am no longer a likely risk if I were to be released. Nothing is more likely to convince a parole board that is likely made up of religious individuals than converting to a particular religion. You say, if the parole board's primarily Christian and these individuals are converting to Islam, that must be even more proof that Islam is true, because if they were faking it or if they were doing it just for attention, they would convert to Christianity in order to appease the board. Well, you don't necessarily know who's going to be on the board, but if you want to show a true conversion, that would be exactly what you do. I don't necessarily sit there in front of the parole board, Muhammad, peace be upon him, blah, blah, blah. I've spoken to this. I realize that you and I might not share the same religion, but I respect your religion, and I am now a changed person, blah, blah, blah. I think that you can make a case that it's even more compelling to convert to a less popular religion and demonstrate that you are changed, that you are what's more demonstrated, or what's more indicative of change than I'm going to kneel and pray 5 times a day, and I'm going to follow an incredibly strict, rigorous, regime. Nadir also kept pointing out that every sciencey thing in the Quran is true, all of them. And he fallaciously presented this as if it's true until I can debunk it. On more than one occasion, he basically said, I have to explain how Muhammad knew these things. Bzz, wrong. You, Nadir, have to prove that he knew them, and then how he knew them. Because until you do that, my inability to show how he knew these things is irrelevant, because the answer is then, did he know them? I don't know. How did he know them? I don't know that either. We're in a position of I don't know. It's not like your proposed explanation wins unless I can debunk it. That's not how reality works and how reasonableness works. And he was upset that I wanted the debate to be about evidence. He doesn't think it should be about evidence. So let's say, for example, that there is a scientific fact in the Quran, some sort of statement in the Quran that is accessible by science. First of all, is it a clear statement of fact? Is it explicit? Is it prone to, does it have to be interpreted as that only after we discover the fact? Is it a statement? If the statement were a fact and it's somehow correct, then how do we explain that it's correct? Now, Nadir used his cops analogy to talk about, is it coincidence? Is it this? Here's the thing. Was it already known at the time? Because some of the things he pointed to were known. Yes, but they couldn't have been known by, someone living in a desert. They couldn't have known how the seas work. I'm sorry, but information travels. And we do learn things. And especially when in a period of time where most of our the items that we're getting through the trade system are coming by sea and then delivering. You hear stories, you tell stories, whatever. So first thing is, was it already known? If it was already known, then saying, how did this person find out? I don't know. Maybe God told them. Or maybe they heard about it from a sea mariner. Or maybe they were in a trade town. Or maybe they heard about it from somebody. Or maybe they had individuals who were learned, who were writing things down, and they hung out with those people in the libraries. The next one is whether or not it was known. Is it a reasonable inference? If you are living in an agrarian society where you're raising animals and you see what happens where similar animals copulate and produce similar offspring, and the offspring often have the traits of the parents, you get in the process of doing animal husbandry and looking at the people around you saying, wow, he looks just like his father, or she looks just like her grandmother, or whatever else. You begin to learn a little bit, not about genetics, but about heredity, about inheritable traits. So was it already known? Was it a reasonable inference? But when the person wrote it down, did they know it was true, or did they believe it was true? Is it clear that when they wrote it down, they were intending to convey the message that you, in fact, are reading from it? You can't even prove the first part of that, let alone the rest. So what are the specific testable claims which are unique to Islam? This is the question that I kept asking, which I don't really think we got anything at all that comes close to that. Because not one of the scientific facts qualifies. None of those are unique to Islam. None of those are relevant to Islam. If I start a new religion and one of the statements about my religion is that water is made up of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom, the fact that that is true has no bearing on whether or not the religious portion of my doctrine is true. If I also add in that the air we breathe is 21% oxygen and that the earth orbits the sun, those are facts that still have no tie to the doctrines of any religion, including Islam. And proving, that those things are true doesn't in any way support Islam or any other religion. But how do they know? Well, you're assuming that they did know. That's the assumption that Nadir and others have made. Similar to problems related to prophecy. How did they know that this was going to happen in the future? Well, you haven't demonstrated that they did know. You haven't even demonstrated in many cases that they thought this is what was going to happen in the future. Because what ends up happening is we find out something, and then it sends everyone scurrying to their holy books to find out, can we find something that matches this, just as they would with the quatrains from Nostradamus and others. Is Islam true? No. Now, that doesn't mean that it's false. It doesn't mean that it can be proved false. It just means that it hasn't met its burden of proof to demonstrate that it's true, and it may forever be incapable of doing that. Both of my opening statements, one from each of those debates, addressed this issue, but in slightly different ways. And my two opponents took similar avenues, but one was really impressed by the age of the statements, and the other was impressed by the perceived perfect accuracy of the statements. The problem with the age of the statements is that that age gets longer and longer and longer. But at some point, it was written down yesterday, 2 weeks ago, a month ago. So the age isn't particularly relevant. What he's trying to suggest is that there's a long period of time from when the statement was made to when it was confirmed. But that's not really true. There's a long period of time between when a scientific fact was demonstrated and understood and spread as information throughout the world as scientific knowledge, and when people went back to try to find passages that seem to be consistent with that while ignoring the other passages that aren't consistent with that. Neither of those things prove the case. The age of the statement that Kinney was impressed with, or the perceived perfect accuracy of the statements that Nadir seemed to be impressed with. Neither of which prove that case, but at least the age is accurate, I guess. The perfect accuracy isn't. It's only after learning things that we go back to find out, oh yes, it says this, and I can interpret it this way. But let's imagine that the Holy Book, whether we're talking about the Bible, the Quran, doesn't matter, flatly said, go and investigate the world, and you will discover things unknown to men today, including the tiny invisible chemical double helix that replicates and provides the mechanisms that guide our development from the moment male and female reproductive tissues unite. The next question of how could someone 1,400 years ago write this remains unanswered. You don't merely get to assume that it must be God, and you don't get to assume that it's accurate when the same book holds everything, or that the other statements that the book makes holds that everything was created in 6 days, and that the order of creation starts with a smoky heaven and an earth, followed by 7 heavens, and then you put stars called lamps in the nearest heaven. When we know that the stars existed before the earth, if your holy book says the earth existed before the stars, you don't get to claim it's 100% right about science. We have no evidence of 7 heavens. We know that sperm doesn't come from between the backbone and the ribs. But even if those scientific facts had turned out to be accurate, that doesn't mean that the other claims about Allah or God or the purpose of life or any of that doesn't mean that any of those are known to be true or reasonable to accept. There's a couple things that I may beat up on him a little bit here. Nadir pointed out that God was the, quote, most smartest conclusion to assume. I'm not just picking out that sentence because it made me and everyone else laugh because it is grammatically and absurd and almost unintelligible. It's because even if we listen charitably, what he's saying is, given all the information, the wisest conclusion to reach is that there is a God. That's the charitable listening. But what he said is most smartest, which is already a problem, but conclusion to assume is the part that I want to focus on, because you don't assume a conclusion. I'm not being uncharitable here. Nadir seems to think that in the absence of evidence to lead to a conclusion, we are justified in reasonably assuming a particular conclusion. And that's not the way reasonableness works. Nadir also spent some time defending the notion that marrying a 9 or 6-year-old is okay if you're convinced that it was ordained or approved by Allah. I'm sure plenty of people will beat him up on that over the years. It wasn't relevant to his topic. It came up during the Q&A because it always does. But it's also not irrelevant, because if in fact Islam were true, and Nadir has a good understanding of Islam, and Nadir's understanding of Islam is true, then that would mean it is true that it is morally permissible and not in conflict with science or sound morals for someone to marry a child. And yet we know from science that this is in fact harmful. We know from information about what ages brains mature, what ages we should have informed consent and reasonably informed consent. We know that all of this is incredibly harmful and disgusting. And that means that even on that front, at least Nadir's view of the Quran is not reasonable, not true, and not good. Kenny was completely impressed that someone 1,400 years ago might have information that he can't imagine they could have. Yet he has no idea what information was or wasn't available at that time to those people. He just invented both accuracy and remarkableness out of whole cloth. He tried to bait me on trans issues, both by giving me his book on the subject and in another comment during the debate, but I didn't take the debate. I didn't take the bait. And that brings me to kind of like my closing thoughts. If you find yourself in a debate about whether or not Islam is true, and you're presented with a bunch of information that maybe you don't know, maybe you haven't had any time to research, stay on topic. You don't have to know or understand anything about the Quran or the science that the Quran seems to address, or even the findings of science, to be able to discuss this. They're the ones who have a claim. They're the ones who have a duty of attempting to convince you. They're the ones who have a burden of proof. So stay on topic. Hold them to proving what they claim is true. And when you ask a question, watch for them to deflect away from the question. Write the question down. Did they actually answer it? When they're done talking, did they address the question that you asked? Because a lot of them will say a lot of things that are deflections in the hopes that you start addressing all of those other points instead of the question, or instead of noticing that they haven't actually addressed the question that was asked. And one of the best questions you can ask is, what are the specific testable claims which are unique to Islam or Christianity or Scientology, or insert your religion here? What are the specific testable claims which are unique to this religious package? Follow that up with, what method did you use to verify the accuracy of those claims? And then, what method did you use to verify how that accuracy was attained? What do you know? How do you know it? And how do you know that your method for achieving that knowledge is viable? In the second debate, in my opening remarks, I addressed this by talking about, and I believe in the first debate as well, that you can't show up with your own measuring stick. You can't say, my faith is reasonable because it's internally consistent. The Quran says this and this and this, and therefore it's internally consistent. But it's externally consistent because it isn't in conflict with science. Or even more, it's perfect about its science, except that the Quran isn't perfect about its science. And even if it were absolutely a list of perfect science facts, followed by a list of not perfect, but a list of doctrinal claims about the religion, the doctrinal claims about the religion aren't true merely because it included some facts alongside of it. That is the rough equivalent of putting someone in a lab coat in order to convince you to buy their product, because you associate lab coat, knowledgeable, doctor, scholar, scientist, and therefore they're more likely to be right. That is propaganda. And that's exactly what both of them did. What are the specific testable claims? How do you verify that they're accurate? What method did you use to verify that accuracy, or that your method was accurate? Those three questions flow one to another. And in two debates, none of them ever got answered. It was just a bunch of, hey, look at this. It's remarkable. You can't explain this. Therefore, Islam is true. No, it's not. That's not how any of this works. See you next time.